This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help you when you need it, so your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
Taxes was paying so much to get your taxes done. Every single year. Now Taxes is getting a TurboTax expert who will beat the price you paid your pro last year, so you get the most money back this year. Now this is Taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Switch to an expert now at turbotax.com/beatyourprice. TurboTax full service only. Proof of amount paid may be required. Must sign up by 3/18 and 5/3/25. Subject to terms at turbotax.com/beatyourprice. See guarantee details at turbotax.com/guarantees.
Welcome to the Covert Narcissism Podcast. I'm your host, Renee Swanson. I am not a therapist, and you are not a victim. Welcome back to the Covert Narcissism Podcast, and I'm so glad today to have Dr. Mazzella here with me. I've been honored to be able to speak with him now a couple of times, and every time we talk, I feel like I learn more and more, just diving a little deeper into this topic with somebody who has made this your career path and an expert in the field and someone who is sought after for help with these narcissistic individuals in our lives. So, Dr. Mazzella, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Of course, and thank you, Renee, for giving me this opportunity. I'm really excited to be here with you. We just finished a conversation on a different type of narcissism, but I'm really happy to be here and jump into to another aspect, let's say, of narcissism.
Absolutely. And I'll mention that part one, in essence, of what we just did, which I got the opportunity and the privilege to be a guest on your show, the Narcissism Decoder. And in that interview or that discussion and dialogue that we had, we talked about what happens when an adult child discovers that their parent is, portraying narcissistic traits and narcissistic behaviors. And that was a great conversation. To my audience, I say, look, if you missed that one, please jump over, to his podcast, and the links will be in the show notes here so that you can find that easily. But this is part two now, and we're flipping it around. We're going to talk about a parent who is discovering narcissistic behaviors in their adult child, which is a whole nother dynamic that is very complicated, to deal with.
Yes.
So let's dive in. Now, we're going to, I think, center this around the topic of vulnerable narcissism. So I'd like to get that started. And Dr. Mazzella, can you just maybe define what vulnerable narcissism is?
Sure. Narcissism presents itself in many different ways. Like, Renee, you were just mentioning that we spoke about covert narcissism. And it's not like you could go to the DSM-5 and find vulnerable or covert narcissism, but what we're talking about, the traits that predominate. So with the vulnerable narcissist, what you typically see, the presentation looks like somebody who is very passive, whining, complaining, right? That they feel helpless, that they don't know how. That's something that you typically hear. They need you to do things for them because they just don't know how to do it themselves. So overall, what you get is a picture of somebody, instead of being overtly grandiose, which is a more common, trait that we typically talk about when we think of narcissism, they're overtly very fragile and needy. So that's the main distinguishing characteristics. Yeah.
Okay. So with the word vulnerable narcissism, so I learned about covert narcissism before I had ever heard the phrase vulnerable narcissist. Right. And what you're describing here, I think a lot of people will use the term vulnerable narcissism or covert narcissism interchangeably.
Yeah.
And I'm learning that that's not necessarily the case. That's something I've just recently been exploring. In fact, on my podcast, talked about this just recently. I'd love to hear your opinion on that, or your
One. Yeah, and there's always some blending like you were describing, right, Renee? So if I could give a very simple example of this just to really drive it home. So many years ago, there was a famous TV show called The Sopranos, and the main actor was Tony Soprano. And Tony Soprano could be described overall as somebody who's more like the grandiose type of narcissist, you know, with lack of empathy, center of attention, big tough guy, maybe some malignant, maybe more like malignant narcissism. But it's very interesting because for people who followed the show, they may remember that deeper into the show, there was a point where he separated from his wife and he moved out. And this is where vulnerable narcissism comes in, and how I'm trying to describe how these traits exist in all different types of narcissistic pathology, which is Tony, the big, strong, tough guy, ends up moving back to his mother's house, right? And this is more characteristic of the vulnerable narcissist. And late at night, this is quite funny, is they show him on the phone, like talking to some of his, gang members, right? And he can't let them off the phone. In other words, he's on the phone and he's feeling very desperate and needy and clingy. And that's exactly what you see in the more typical vulnerable type of narcissistic presentation. But I mentioned it because you're right, Renee. There are distinct characteristics, that separate them out, but there's some blending as well. So even the most grandiose, malignant type of narcissism can, when feel slighted or encounters a separation, can become quite vulnerable, needy, and clingy and demanding. So, and why is this important? In my mind, because I'm a clinician, or, I do a lot of therapy with these patients, I'm always thinking in terms of intervention. So for people who are listening to your podcast, maybe we could talk about how to relate to somebody like this in their life, because you're going to relate to somebody in a much different way who presents as grandiose or covert, right? Because they have different tactics. They use different tactics with you to get, the recognition or supplies that they need, as compared to the vulnerable narcissist. So inevitably, the way you speak to them, the way you try to connect to them is going to be different. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it does, I find it does do a person a whole lot of good to have an increased awareness of what are the, maybe even what are the driving forces, where a grandiose narcissist, their driving force may be they want to be admired and they want to feel superior, they want to feel entitled, and so that is their driving force.
Yes.
Whereas a vulnerable narcissist, their driving force is they want to be pampered and cared for, they want to feel pity. So knowing that will help you to navigate this relationship.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I mean, if you could tolerate I'll give just a little bit of theory. Like I always feel like a little bit of theory of how someone becomes who they are today is important. And, there are many different theories out there in terms of what leads someone to have these narcissistic characteristics. But one theory, I borrow from psychoanalytic theory because that's my bias. I'm a psychoanalyst, a psychotherapist. And one particular theory says that the vulnerable narcissism is basically just a defense mechanism, right? It defends against profound feelings of what? Unworthiness or powerlessness. And these feelings come up when there are early relationship failures, basically. So if you think about it, if there are these relationship failures, there's this fragmented sense of self, there's this longing, or we could say craving for something that they never got early on. Because if you think about their earliest development, when they express the need, right? Because that's what we see today with the vulnerable narcissist, is they're so needy. But as a child growing up, the expressions of need, like smiles, right? Whatever it was that they did, cries, pleas, they were met with indifference. In other words, they learn to doubt their ability to attract care. And they need care, like all children need care growing up. And the reason that they don't get the care is because oftentimes these individuals grow up with caregivers who maybe are emotionally detached. Maybe they're cold. Maybe they're depressed. Maybe they have their own narcissistic preoccupations. Again, what we were just talking about in that prior episode, that yes, the parents can be narcissistically preoccupied. So what happens is, since they have these needs that go unmet, and in order to survive, we need that sort of recognition, they figure out a way to get the needs met in an omnipotent way. And that's the omnipotence that you typically hear about, right, in narcissism. And the way that they do it, the way that the vulnerable narcissist gets their needs met in this omnipotent way, is through what we call the literal mode. In other words, it's literally, I need you to take care of me. I need you to be there for me. I need you to tell me what to do. Because as I mentioned earlier, the feeling is often like, I don't know, or I don't know how to do that, or I don't know what you mean. And when they do that, they position you to step in and literally take care of a need for them. So I'll stop there because I don't want to go too far afield into theory, but that's the theory in a nutshell.
And that's, yeah, I mean, that's great. You described it really, really well. That's a great way to look at it. And I love what you said. They learned to not trust their ability to attract care. Like that really jumped out at me there, because we're talking about now a parent who is discovering narcissistic behaviors in their adult child.
Yes.
And so we're looking at this child who is portraying narcissistic behaviors. And I mean, I would imagine as a parent in that situation, now you're going to do a whole lot of self-reflecting on yourself and go, okay, what did I do wrong? What did I mess up? And so I imagine that that's going to be a part of all of this too, is trying to, is it fixable? I used to panic thinking, okay, at what age is it too late that my kids are going to be narcissistic because of what's going on in my household?
Yes.
And when is it going to be too late for that child? So what would you say to the parents who, are running into this?
Well, first, the way you described it, I think they're going to be like one step ahead of the game, because if you're already reflecting, like, what did I do to contribute? What did I inadvertently do to contribute to this problem, right? If you recognize that there's this problem, let's say, for instance, you have an adult child, right, who's still living at home or is financially dependent on you, then you are already in a more reflective state of mind, right? And when you're in that state of mind, then you could say, all right, so what I'm doing obviously is not working. So maybe meeting their needs literally, right? Like, they demand, I don't know, because they don't clean up their room, that you are still cleaning their room as an adult child. You are still cleaning their room, or helping them with their banking, or getting a job, or whatever it might be, right? Because we're talking about sometimes a severe level of passivity in some of these individuals, these adult children. So the first thing to do is to not get angry, right? And also not come in with solutions. Like, that is so hard, because you're like, I want to help. This is my child. I love my child. I want the best for them. So the urge is always there to come in with a solution. But when you come in with a solution, it just undermines their own sort of intrinsic motivation, we could say, right? That they are no longer motivated to do it on their own, because why? Now they have you. And that's exactly what they want, by the way, because according to that theory that I mentioned just a moment ago, if they missed out on this early, sort of, again, in psychoanalytic theory, they call it the narcissistic stage. Like, there are certain phases of development one goes through in early childhood. Some call it the symbiotic phase. In other words, it's just a period of time that a child really needs to go through where they feel like all their needs are being met, that the parent is there, right? Renee, you know this, in a consistent and reliable way. We said it in the earlier episode. Not perfect. They don't have to be perfect, but they do have to be consistent and reliable, and give the child a feeling like all their needs are going to be met, right?
Right.
And slowly, with everyday frustrations, when handled appropriately, again, not with anger or frustration, they begin to increase their level of frustration tolerance. But with these adult children, they never got that because, like I described, their earlier needs never went met. So they're literally looking today for the adult to do this, but it doesn't work, unfortunately. And that's what a lot of parents bump into. And that's, again, based on the reflection that you just mentioned, Renee, right? Something I'm doing or that I did is not working. So now I need to pivot and figure out a way to approach this child to move them along developmentally, if that makes sense.
That makes complete sense. And what we talked about in the previous episode that we met together for is that these kids need connection more than they need correction. And as a child is growing, yes, they need correction and they need guidance. I'm not saying they don't, but the connection is so valuable to them.
Yeah.
It's
Yes. So like if you're trying to monitor what time they what time they wake up and what time they get out of bed and why do they sleep so late and why are they not looking for a job or why are they playing video games all day or they're just wasting time, all of that is the correction, all of that. And it will never solve the problem, unfortunately, even though in your heart, you think that you waking them up in the morning when they're sleeping into 11 a.m. or something is what's best for them. It's not what they need. It's exactly the opposite because what they need is that connection, Renee, which just basically means they need somebody that they know who's going to be there to create space for them, right? At the times that are most challenging, right? They don't need to be confronted with anger. They don't need to be told what to do. And they certainly don't need to be gratified in that literal way because that's what leads to an insatiable demand because it's not really what they need. And the other thing that leads to an insatiable demand, and this is more common, is people will try to meet their needs and then eventually get frustrated.
Taxes was paying so much to get your taxes done. Every single year. Now Taxes is getting a TurboTax expert who will beat the price you paid your pro last year, so you get the most money back this year. Now this is Taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Switch to an expert now at turbotax.com/beatyourprice. TurboTax full service only. Proof of amount paid may be required. Must sign up by 3/18 and file by 3/25. Subject to terms at turbotax.com/beatyourprice. See guarantee details at turbotax.com/guarantees.
Because they realize it's not putting a dent in the problem. So then once they get frustrated, that's like a recapitulation of the earlier rejection that they bumped up against when I said earlier in life, they maybe had a parent who was preoccupied and couldn't be there for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then it just becomes a cycle that plays through the rest of this adult life.
Yeah.
You know, where with that connection piece is, I like to look at it as giving them safety, giving them emotional safety. And with that emotional safety, then when a person feels safe, growth can happen. The opposite absolutely being true, when a person does not feel safe, growth cannot happen. That being 100% true. So you've got even a child in school. If a child in school is not feeling safe, they're not going to learn their multiplication tables very well that day.
Yep. Nothing is suitable for storage. That's the way we say it in my field. Mm-hmm. So in other words, you have to be in a regulated state of mind in order to learn and to learn from experience. And anytime, emotions are high, that's what we call dysregulation. So whenever there's fighting, arguing, or you trying to convince the adult child, in terms of how they should live their life, that's already a dysregulated state. And that's not going to be suitable for storage. Nothing will ever be taken in.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right there. And so me as a parent of this adult child, even if I come in with the greatest amount of care and compassion, and I really truly just want what's right, what I see as right for this child, okay? Because perception is everything. But I can even approach it that way. But if I'm still saying, hey, but you need to get a job, you need to get on your feet, knowing that there could be some true benefit for my child in that, but it could just push them into shame.
Yes.
And I don't even mean to.
Yeah.
But even that could feed the vulnerable narcissist.
Yes, absolutely. So we're talking about things not to do, right?
Yeah. So what do you do?
Yes. Now, okay. So this part gets a little complicated and kind of like the theory. I promise you, I won't go into too much detail here. I'll just do enough that you and I can have a dialogue about it, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So the thing that I found to be most helpful, and this actually is supported by empirical research, the people who study psychotherapy with people who have personality disorders, the one thing that across the board with all different personality disorders that's most effective is what we call containment. So containment, let me give an illustration of it rather than just defining it. So the child comes in hot, right? With some intense emotion. It's like, I used this analogy before. It's like handing somebody a hot potato. So they project or give you the hot potato. And that could just look something like as simple as you're giving them some advice or a suggestion and they reject it, right? Because now emotions go up because you're trying very hard to be helpful. And it hurts when someone just dismisses you, right? Or they say, I don't know how, or there are no jobs out there for me, or whatever excuse they may have. So the goal for the parent then is to contain the intense affect. Again, Renee, you sort of helped me out in part one of this, where you called me and said, well, that's like, what did you call it? Like an advanced level or something. I forgot what you and I were talking about, but I was demonstrating how to talk to a parent, right? When setting a boundary. I think that's what it was. Well,
Yes, a deeper level of healing when we can start to refine and reframe
yeah.
our approach.
Yeah. So for this containment to work, I admit that the parent then needs to be in that state of mind that you mentioned earlier, Renee, where they're in more reflective and open state of mind. Like what I have done so far obviously is not working, so I'm open to trying something else. So the something else is when it's projected onto you, you do not deflect it. You do not create a boundary. Again, if you're in your own regulated state of mind, you hold the hot potato. In other words, you figure out a way to hold it without getting burnt and to cool it down so that you could give it back to them in a more digestible form. What you and I were just talking about, learning from experience. So something is too hot for them to hold. An emotion is too hot. They literally need care. So that means they're not in a reflective state. So you take that, maybe, you figure out how to juggle it a little bit. You're cooling it down. So that's what we call metabolizing it. So you're metabolizing an emotion that they don't even have a name for, right? And then once you cool it down, what I meant by give it back is you give the projection back, but not with anger, not with demands, not with suggestions, but with understanding. And that's where empathy comes in and what you were calling connection. And when I say empathy, I don't mean just, oh, I'm sorry, that must be so difficult for you to wake up, before 9 a.m. because you didn't sleep well. That's not the kind of empathy I'm talking about. I'm talking about like empathy in the sense of like really getting in there to understand your child's subjective experience. Even though you don't agree with it, right? You want to get as close as possible, as long as, again, you're in a regulated state so that you can begin to help them give words that they don't even have for what's going on inside of them. So there's a lot more to it, but let me just pause there because I'm always curious how people hear this when I say it. Where to with every night?
I love the hot potato analogy. I think that is a great description because when you are, in communication with a narcissistic person and they throw those emotions at you,
Yes.
it literally is like they are throwing that hot potato at you.
Yes.
And
They are.
if you grab it and throw it right back, this is going to escalate.
Yep. And that's almost always what happens, even when people don't think they're doing it. Like so many times, like when listeners of my podcast reach out to me and they're like, I tried what you said and it didn't work. And I'm like, go over the details, and I do this with my patients as well. And what you hear is they get angry or responsive or they give suggestions. Yeah, maybe they give suggestions. And even that, it's so good-hearted. Like it comes from a good place in your heart, but it's not what the adult child needs. So then we have to slow it down. And this is where specificity comes in, which is what I was getting into in part one, is the precise words you use are so important because you're dealing with somebody obviously who's so vulnerable and who's going to be prone to feeling slighted like all narcissists are.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. They do. They are very prone to that, which kind of leads to that question of, why do they demand constant attention, but they're never satisfied? That kind of goes right along with kind of what we're talking about. And so those emotions get thrown at you, which can catch you off guard because
Yeah.
you're coming from such a good place.
Yes. Yeah, because what it seems like what they're looking for is help managing something literally in their life. But now you know, and if this makes sense, hopefully your listeners know as well, that's not what they're looking for. They're not looking for help balancing their bank account or getting a job. It presents that way, but what they can't articulate is what they're really looking for is the validation, the empathy that I just mentioned, the containing the emotions, and eventually, hopefully, helping them begin to put words to it. So, like, for instance, when they make a demand, when I wake up, maybe you could have breakfast ready for me, mom, right? Or, I did get a job. I got a job and now I'm working these long hours. You don't think you can have dinner ready for me when I come home? And by the way, this isn't just like parent, adult, child. Like you could picture this in any,
Yes.
yeah. So the first step is like, if you don't become reactive, you can appreciate. That's the validating piece. Like, yes, I understand that you've had a very long day. Yes, I appreciate, that you have a lot going on in your life right now, right? But that's not enough. Remember I said that's usually just enough to get them into a more regulated state of mind because they feel heard now, right? Like they feel like you heard them and you could appreciate that they're busy. But then what you want to do, the next step to it would be, but let's think together. Like let's figure out how we could work, like how we can manage this in the mornings for you, right? In other words, you're willing to help them think through the problem, which is very different than solving the problem for them.
Yes.
And you see this all the time. Like I see this, with my own patients, is you can hear them talking about getting a job, for instance. And then suddenly they're like, oh, there's no work out there for me, or I have no skills, or, I've sent 1,000 resumes and nobody responds. Right there is a moment of escalation. You could slow that down and you could say, wait, what just happened? I'm a little confused. You were thinking about getting a job and then suddenly you said, nope, I can't do it. What happened at that moment? What went through your mind? See, Renee, that's what I'm really trying to get at because something leads, like they're about to take a step of independence, which is like thinking about getting a job, but then they shift and they're like, nope, I can't do it. So rather than getting frustrated with them, what we want to try to do is help them understand what just happened in that moment where you went from really thinking about how to manage something in your life to it becoming completely unmanageable.
Yeah. Now, what I hear you describing from the parent's perspective, then that's going to require a whole lot of their own emotional growth,
Yes.
a
Yeah.
whole lot of their own emotional regulation. Because when you hear the sharp tongue that comes flying out of your adult child's mouth, okay, or the defeatist attitude like you're describing,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't want to go into fix it mode, which would be my tendency, is I would go into fix it mode and start, well, but have you tried this? Have you tried that? And what about these? And instead you're saying, "Ooh, take a step back," which, is going to require a whole lot of your own awareness and your own growth.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. And trust me, I'm not suggesting that this is easy, but any change is difficult, you see. And if you want to break an entrenched pattern, which obviously it is, because it takes a lot for someone to get to this, where we're actually considering that they may have a personality disorder. You and I use the word traits, but even having these traits is quite serious. So it's going to take some effort. I'm sorry to say that. You're right, Renee. It is. But I hope through listening to podcasts like yours, right, and the content you put out, awareness allows you to have some space. You see what I mean? So if you are more aware that this is just a manifest presentation, that things are escalating, but this is not really what they need, or this is not really what they're looking for, what I hope is that cools you down a little bit already. And that allows you to become less reactive. It's kind of like people say about the grandiose narcissist, that when they're bragging, that could be very off-putting too. It's kind of like the vulnerable narcissist complaining, right?
Right.
So when the grandiose narcissist is bragging, one way not to become triggered or reactive is to do what? To say to yourself, geez, something must have happened right now that they're feeling quite insecure or they're feeling quite threatened. I wonder what just happened. And then when you approach it with curiosity, you have some space and you don't feel so minimized by their bragging or diminished by them, if that makes sense. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too lofty in my expectations.
I think that makes complete sense. And you just said something that is definitely a path that I have taken with a lot of the people that I work with, is approach it with curiosity.
Yes.
Look at it with that curiosity of, okay, what's going on in their world that is causing that hot potato to come flying out? Because it's not about, when they're lashing out about, can't find a job, those emotions coming out are not about the job.
Yep.
Exhibit underlying something going on here.
Yes. Yep. That's exactly it. And now you also know that if you manage something for them instead of managing it with them, like if you still want to be helpful, right, Renee? I'm not saying don't help them, but you help them in a very different way. To go back to where we started, just to sort of pull it together, you don't help them in the literal way. In other words, you're not performing for them, because then it's just a transaction. Now it's transactional where you're performing for them in a literal way. And that goes back to what we said earlier. This is why things never change and get better, because there's no opportunity then there for growth. Because again, that's not what they really need. What they need is somebody that's there for them in a connected way, not like literally taking care of them.
Yeah. A connected way and a consistent way, because that's where they start to find the safety.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Dr. Mazzella, thank you so much for bringing all this to the table and for bringing this to this audience. I know this is of great value, so thank you. I want to kind of give you the last word here to wrap this up, but what would you present to these parents who are kind of facing this? Any kind of thoughts for them to just kind of leave them with maybe a direction that they need to head?
Yeah, I guess the main takeaways, because I'm always thinking about improving interactions. Like, yeah, we talk about how it presents itself and we have some theory, but I guess the main takeaway is, if you can leave with this one word in mind, containment, right? That's the main word. And in containment, we said, is the empathy, is the validating, is curiosity, asking questions, being curious, in your mind, taking a guess at what they're going through. And don't get caught up in the manifest presentation, because that then just repeats the process. So good luck with it. I hope it's helpful. I've certainly had people write into me eventually who try this stuff, not with parents, Renee, but like with their husband. It's really interesting watching this over the last year or so since I started the podcast. It's like, I'm going to divorce my covert narcissistic husband, right? And slowly over time, what I begin to hear is, I'm trying to talk to my covert narcissistic husband rather than just label him as a covert narcissist. And then that progressed to, I'm having coffee, watching the sunset, listening to your podcast with my husband. So it's like, try it, give it a shot. Who knows? I mean, if anything, maybe it breaks the pattern, but you'll let Renee know, right?
Yeah, and let me know. Yes, 100%. And if then, add to that, when you're dealing with this with your adult child, that's not a situation where you want to divorce or separate, and so it does add that we definitely need, I call it workarounds, even in a marriage. I'm going to work around the narcissism that's there and see if this is going to be, an improvement in our relationship. But that all goes back to my own awareness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Renee. A big thank you to you for having me on your show and giving me this opportunity to share some of my own thoughts on this, another complicated aspect of narcissism. So thanks again.
You're so welcome, and thank you for being here. And to my audience, I know that this is of great value to you, and I thank you for all the wonderful feedback that I get all the time on the different guests that we have here. And I wish you so much peace. on your journey of healing.
You have been listening to the Covert Narcissism Podcast. If you are struggling with covert narcissism in your life, I help people to heal from covert narcissistic abuse. If you are struggling with the isolation, the self-doubt, and the obsessive thinking, then this is the program for you. I offer both group and individual options. This is live, personalized coaching that is specific to covert narcissism. Reach out to me anytime. You can find me at my website, covertnarcissism.com. I'm not a therapist and you are not a victim. I am a coach and you are a survivor. I wish you so much peace on your journey of healing. The information provided by Renee Swanson and the Covert Narcissism Podcast is for educational purposes only and is not to be used for diagnosis purposes and not intended to be a substitute for clinical care. Please consult a healthcare provider for guidance specific to your case. This material discusses narcissism in general. It does not claim that any specific person has narcissism and should not be used to refer to any specific person as having narcissism. Permission is not granted to link to or repost this material to support an allegation or a claim that any specific person is a narcissist. That would be an unauthorized misuse of the material and information provided.
Taxes was paying so much to get your taxes done every single year. Now Taxes is getting a TurboTax expert who will beat the price you paid your pro last year, so you get the most money back this year. Now this is Taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Switch to an expert now at turbotax.com/beatyourprice. TurboTax full service only. Proof of amount paid may be required. Must sign up by 3/18 and 5/3/25. Subject to terms at turbotax.com/beatyourprice. See guarantee details at turbotax.com/guarantees.